There is a scene in season 7 of Rick and Morty where Rick finally kills the man who murdered his wife. He sits with it afterward and feels absolutely nothing. Albert Einstein signed the letter that started the atomic bomb program in 1939. He spent the last 16 years of his life calling it the greatest mistake he ever made. Two geniuses, one real, one fictional. Both built the same way, broken by the same things, running from the same grief, and arriving at the same hollow place at the end of the road they spent everything to reach. This essay is not about who is smarter. It is about what being this smart actually costs. The marriages it destroys, the children it fails, the weapons it releases into the world, the 30-year obsessions that consume the back half of a life and produce nothing, the victories that arrive empty. Welcome to Ricktopus. If this is your first time here, stay close. Let's get into it. The broken origin. There is a version of Albert Einstein that most people never think about. Not the one with the wild white hair and the equation on the blackboard. Not the one on the poster in every high school science classroom. The one sticking his tongue out like he finds the whole thing funny. Not the name people throw around when they want to say someone is a genius without actually explaining why. The version most people never think about is the one sitting in a Berlin apartment in 1912, writing love letters to another woman while his wife is pregnant with his second child. That version is a lot more interesting, and a lot more familiar if you have ever watched a man use his intelligence to run away from the things he cannot fix. Rick Sanchez does this every single episode. The comparison people reach for when they want to describe how smart Rick is almost always Einstein. He comes up in fan forums, in YouTube comments, in the lazy shorthand version of the argument. Rick is basically what Einstein would be if Einstein had a portal gun. The assumption underneath that comparison is that Einstein represents the ceiling of what real human intelligence can do, and Rick is the fantasy version of that ceiling with the roof blown off. What almost nobody talks about is that Einstein and Rick Sanchez are not just similar in terms of raw brain power. They are similar in the specific, painful, very human way their genius made everything else in their lives worse. The science got bigger, the life got smaller, and both men ended up in the same place. Brilliant, lonely, and haunted by the thing they started that they could not stop. This is where both of them begin. Not with a theory, not with a discovery, with a home they destroyed. Albert Einstein met Mileva Maric at the Zurich Polytechnic Institute in Switzerland. She was studying physics, the only woman in her program. Einstein was drawn to her immediately, not just personally, but intellectually. She was one of the few people alive who could actually follow what he was thinking. Their letters from the early years of their relationship read like two people who are genuinely in love and genuinely excited about the same ideas at the same time. They called each other pet names. They talked about physics like it was a shared adventure. By all accounts, for a while, it worked. They had a daughter before they were married, a girl named Liesel, born in 1902, who disappeared from the historical record almost immediately after her birth. She was likely given up for adoption, possibly died of scarlet fever in infancy. History does not have a clear answer. What is clear is that Einstein never publicly acknowledged she existed. They married in 1903. Their son Hans Albert was born in 1904. Their son Edward was born in 1910. By 1912, Einstein was writing letters to his cousin Elsa and telling her that he thought of her every spare minute and was as unhappy as a man could be. He described his love for Mileva as having been misguided. He talked about the life he imagined he should have had. Mileva was still his wife. Edward was 2 years old. This is not the version of Einstein that gets put on posters. The marriage limped forward for 2 more years before Mileva found out about the affair and left with the children, moving back to Zurich. Einstein stayed in Berlin. He was elected to scientific positions, gave lectures, became famous. His work during this period was extraordinary. His personal life was a catastrophe that he kept at arm's length by staying extremely busy being a genius. He and Mileva finally divorced in 1919. By then, the terms of the settlement included something that tells you everything about where Einstein's head was during those years. He promised her that if he ever won a Nobel Prize, he would give her the money. He won the Nobel Prize in 1921. He gave her the money. He had already remarried Elsa by then. The divorce settlement was not warm. It was accounting. What this means, practically, is that the greatest scientific mind of the 20th century spent the years in which he was producing his most important work simultaneously dismantling the only home life he had. The man who was quietly rewriting humanity's understanding of gravity and time and space was also, in the same years, writing letters about his misguided love for his wife while she raised his children in another country. The brilliance and the wreckage were not separate things. They were happening at the same time, in the same life, powered by the same engine. Rick Sanchez, in his original life, was nothing like the version the show gives you in the first episode. The backstory, confirmed across multiple seasons and fully locked in by season 5 and season 7, is straightforward and devastating. Before everything else, before the portal gun and the interdimensional interdimensional travel and the Galactic Federation and the Citadel of Ricks, there was just a man named Rick who was a scientist, who had a wife named Diane, and who was content. He was not trying to conquer the universe. He was not running from anything. He was working on teleportation technology in a garage. He had a daughter named Beth, and he had a home he was happy to be in. That is the entire picture. It is, by the standards of what Rick Sanchez eventually becomes, almost embarrassingly ordinary. Then, another Rick showed up. This other Rick, who the show eventually names Rick Prime, the main antagonist of the later seasons, came through a portal with an offer. He wanted Rick to take the secret of interdimensional travel, join the other versions of himself already traveling the multiverse, and leave his family behind to do it. Rick C-137 said no. He turned down the offer. The show makes clear that he was not tempted. He had what he wanted. Science was great, but Diane and Beth were what the life was actually for. Rick Prime did not take the rejection well. A bomb came through a portal into Rick's garage. It killed Diane. It killed Beth. It killed the entire version of Rick Sanchez that had ever been at peace with anything. What followed was the creation of the portal gun, built out of grief, built out of rage, built specifically so Rick could find the man who took everything from him. The search for Rick Prime consumed years, then decades, and in the long, empty stretch of that search, during the years when Rick failed to find him and kept failing and kept drinking and kept destroying versions of himself he ran into along the way, something happened to what Rick was. He stopped being a scientist who had lost his family. He became something else. The nihilism, the drinking, the absolute refusal to let anyone get close, the constant insistence that nothing matters and no one should expect anything from him, all of it traces back to that garage. All of it traces back to Diane. The man was built on top of a wound that never closed, and everything the show gives you for 7 seasons is just the scar tissue that grew over it. The parallel here is not a coincidence, and it is not just surface level. Both men had a home, both men lost it. Both men responded by going somewhere extremely far away and becoming extremely productive, and keeping the grief at a distance by staying in constant motion. Einstein did it across Europe and eventually across the Atlantic, collecting positions and prizes and correspondence and becoming the most famous scientist in the world, while his sons grew up without him in Zurich. Rick did it across the multiverse, dimension after dimension, adventure after adventure, never stopping long enough to feel the thing he was running from. The intelligence, in both cases, was the tool they used to avoid the thing they could not fix. This is the piece that most Einstein analysis skips past, because it is uncomfortable. It is easier to treat the genius and the personal failure as 2 separate stories happening to the same man, but they are not separate. The same capacity that let Einstein see the universe more clearly than almost any human being who ever lived also let him rationalize, compartmentalize, and explain away the damage he was doing to the people closest to him. Smart people are very good at having reasons. Einstein always had reasons. Rick always has reasons. The reasons are usually right. That is the whole problem. A lesser man, in Einstein's position, might have collapsed under the weight of a failing marriage, an absent father, a son who was sliding toward a mental breakdown. Einstein kept working. He had the ability to wall off the pain and stay functional. That ability is genuinely remarkable. It is also, from another angle, a description of someone who did not allow himself to fully feel what was happening to his family until it was too late to do anything about it. Rick does this every episode. He turns himself into a pickle to avoid family therapy. He wipes his own memory rather than sit with a feeling he does not want to have. He dismantles the Galactic Federation, not because he has a plan for what comes next, but because the alternative is going home and facing something. The intelligence is real. The avoidance is also real. In Rick's case, as in Einstein's, both of these things are true at the same time. There is one more layer to this that matters before the rest of the essay can do what it needs to do. Einstein did not leave Mileva because he stopped caring about his children. The letters make clear he was genuinely attached to his sons, especially in the early years. He took them on vacations. He wrote to them regularly. He felt real distress when things went wrong. The picture of Einstein as simply a cold and absent father is not accurate. What is accurate is that he chose the work repeatedly when the work and the family came into conflict. He moved to Berlin for a set of academic positions that he knew Mileva did not want and would not be happy in. When the marriage fell apart as a result, he stayed in Berlin rather than following his children to Zurich. When Edward's mental health began to decline in the late 1920s, Einstein was in the middle of his most intense period of work on unified field theory. He was engaged. He was writing. He was building something. He was also not there. Rick's version of this is the show's most honest observation about what it costs to be around someone like him. He loves Morty. The show makes that clear, even when Rick himself won't say it. But loving Morty and consistently doing right by Morty Morty are two different things, and Rick fails the second one constantly. He uses Morty as a shield against the pain of traveling alone. He puts Morty in danger without fully accounting for what that costs. He is capable of warmth, and then he runs from it the moment it requires something from him. Einstein gave Mileva the Nobel Prize money. Rick sometimes saves the universe. Both of these things are true, and neither of them quite covers what was missing. The broken origin is not an excuse for either of them. It is an explanation. There is a man underneath the genius, in both cases, who made a home once and then watched it come apart and spent the rest of his life being brilliant in the wreckage. That is the foundation everything else in this essay is built on. __quote_0___. But if the broken home is where both stories start, the next chapter is where things get truly dark. Because the genius that couldn't save the marriage also couldn't save the son. And the way both Einstein and Rick handled that specific failure tells you more about what intelligence actually is and what it cannot do than any equation either of them ever wrote. Section 2. The son they couldn't save. There is a specific kind of failure that belongs only to the very smart. It is not the failure of not knowing enough. It is not the failure of not trying hard enough. It is the failure that happens when someone has more raw mental ability than almost any other person alive, and it turns out that none of that ability applies to the problem standing directly in front of them. The problem that is not a theory or an equation or a puzzle with a solution waiting to be found. The problem that is just a person, a child. Someone who needed something from them that intelligence could not provide, and money could not replace, and fame could not substitute for. Albert Einstein failed this way with his son Edward. Rick Sanchez fails this way with Beth. The shape of both failures is almost identical, and the reason that matters is not because it is sad, though it is genuinely very sad. It matters because it is the clearest evidence in either story that genius has a ceiling, that there is a category of problem that being the smartest person in the room makes worse rather than better, that the same brain that can see the hidden structure of the universe can be completely useless when the thing it needs to understand is sitting across the kitchen table. Neither man could see that until it was too late. One of them never saw it at all. Edward Einstein was born in Zurich on July 28, 1910. He was the younger of Albert Einstein's two sons from his marriage to Mileva Marek. His older brother Hans Albert was athletic and sociable, and moved through the world with relative ease. Edward was different from the beginning. He was a sickly child who spent a lot of his early years too weak to leave the house, too frail to go on family trips that the rest of them could take, often stuck indoors while the world outside continued without him. What he had instead was a remarkable inner life. He was drawn to poetry and music. He was considered by his teachers to be one of the most intellectually gifted students they had seen. He had a specific, deep interest in the work of Sigmund Freud, the famous doctor who spent his career trying to understand how the human mind worked. Edward wanted to be a psychiatrist. He wanted to spend his life understanding what went on inside people's heads. In 1929, he finished his school exams as one of the top students in his class and enrolled in university to begin studying medicine. He was 20 years old. He had his whole life mapped out in front of him. Then, in 1930, everything collapsed. An unhappy love affair with an older woman sent Edward into a depression that kept getting worse. He attempted to end his own life. In 1931, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and admitted to a psychiatric clinic for the first time. He was 21 years old. Schizophrenia in 1931 was not the same problem it is today. The treatments available then were not treatments in any real sense of the word. Doctors at that time had almost nothing that worked. What they had instead were experiments. One of the most common was electroconvulsive therapy, which involved running electrical shocks through a patient's brain in the hope that this would somehow reset whatever had gone wrong. Edward's brother Hans Albert became convinced, and said so directly, that these treatments did permanent damage to Edward's brain. They seemed to destroy large parts of his memory and his ability to think clearly. The bright, poetry-writing, Freud-reading young man who had passed his exams at the top of his class came out of these treatments with his speech damaged, his cognitive abilities significantly reduced, and his university career finished before it ever properly started. Edward went home to his mother, then back to the clinic, then home again. His mother Mileva became his primary caregiver, managing his illness for years while Albert Einstein continued his career in Berlin, and then, from 1933, in the United States. Albert left Germany in 1933 because the Nazis had come to power, and the situation for Jewish people in Germany was rapidly becoming dangerous. He immigrated to the United States and took a position at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. He brought his second wife, Elsa. He could not bring Edward, whose mental state had deteriorated to the point where the journey was not possible. Before leaving, Albert made sure to visit Edward one last time. That visit was the last time they ever saw each other. Edward Einstein spent the rest of his life either at his mother's home or in psychiatric clinics in Switzerland. When Mileva died in 1948, Edward had no one left to care for him at home. He was committed permanently to the Burgosli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich. He stayed there until he died of a stroke in October 1965 at the age of 55. Albert Einstein had died 10 years earlier in 1955, never having seen his son again after that goodbye in 1933. In a letter Albert wrote to a colleague during Edward's illness, he said that his little boy's condition depressed him greatly and that it was impossible that Edward would become a fully developed person. Then he went back to work. There is something to pay attention to in that letter, in the way Einstein framed Edward's illness as a problem of potential cut short, of a person who would not get to become what they were supposed to become. It is the framing of a man who understood suffering as a kind of intellectual waste, a mind that could have contributed something, now locked away, a capacity that existed and would now go unused. What is missing from that framing is the simpler thing, the thing that does not require Einstein to be a villain to notice. What Edward might have needed, more than any treatment or any clinic, was a father who stayed. Einstein did not stay. He had reasons. The reasons were real. The Nazis were a genuine threat. The United States was safer. His work needed to continue. All of that is true. And Edward was also 22 years old, sick, having the worst years of his life, and watching his father pack up and move to another continent. They wrote letters. Albert made sure to remain a presence in Edward's life through correspondence even across the Atlantic. He sent money. He was not indifferent. But there is a difference between being a presence in someone's life and being present in their life. And Albert Einstein, by 1933, was only ever able to offer the first kind. The letters and the money were not enough. They were never going to be enough. And the man who figured out how light bends around massive objects in space could not figure out how to fix that, because it was not the kind of problem that had a solution he was able to provide. Rick Sanchez and Beth have a different version of the same story, but the structure underneath it is almost exactly the same. Beth Smith grew up without her father. This is established in the show very early and confirmed in more detail as the seasons go on. Rick was absent for most of Beth's childhood and a large portion of her adult life. He showed up at the beginning of the series after a long disappearance, moved back into the garage, and inserted himself back into a family that had already built a life around the fact that he was not there. Beth's relationship with Rick is one of the most layered things in the show, and it is layered specifically because of what his absence did to her. She is a heart surgeon, which is objectively impressive, and she is also deeply, quietly desperate for her father's approval in a way that shapes almost every decision she makes. She married Jerry, a man she eventually admits she does not fully respect, partly because Rick was not around to be the thing she was actually reaching for. She stayed in a life that did not entirely fit her because she had been reaching her whole childhood for a connection that was not available. When Rick finally comes back, she cannot fully let herself be angry about the years that were missing. She is too relieved to have him there at all. That relief and that anger sit in the same place in her for the entire run of the show, and the show never fully resolves it because it cannot be fully resolved. The damage was done in the years of absence, and no amount of interdimensional adventure can undo it. Rick knows this. There are moments scattered across the show, usually brief and usually undercut by something before they can settle into anything too real, where the show lets Rick see clearly what his absence cost Beth. He does not handle these moments well. He changes the subject. He makes a joke. He invents something. He finds an escape route. He is the smartest being in the universe, and he has absolutely no idea what to do with his daughter's pain except get out of the room before it lands on him. In season 3, Rick does something that looks like sacrifice, but is also, if you look at it from a certain angle, another escape. He allows himself to be sent to the garage, removed from authority in the house, positioned as less than what he actually is, all in the stated service of protecting his family. But the result of that sacrifice is that he avoids having to be a father again in any real way. He is present, he is technically there, he is not actually available. Albert Einstein, from Princeton, was present in Edward's life. He wrote letters, he was technically there. The structure is the same. What makes this comparison genuinely worth sitting with is that both men were not cruel. This is important to say clearly because the easier version of this story makes Einstein a monster who abandoned a sick child, and makes Rick a selfish drunk who used his family as cover. Those versions are simpler, and they miss the point. Einstein was genuinely distressed by Edward's illness. He lost sleep over it. His second wife, Elsa, wrote to friends that the sorrow over Edward was eating Albert alive, that he found it almost impossible to cope with. He did not pretend the problem did not exist. He felt it. Rick, in moments the show allows to breathe before he collapses them, genuinely loves Beth. This is not a complicated reading of the text. The show states it. His actions, when you track them across multiple seasons, show a man who wants to be what his daughter needs, and who consistently, repeatedly fails to get there. The failure in both cases is not the absence of love. It is the absence of the specific skill that the situation required. The skill of being vulnerable enough to be useful to someone else's pain. The skill of staying in the room when the room is uncomfortable. The skill of not solving the problem, but simply being present with the person who has it. Neither Einstein nor Rick possesses that skill in any meaningful quantity. What they both possess instead is an extraordinary talent for being somewhere else, for finding the more manageable crisis, for being genuinely, productively, impressively busy in a way that makes the abdication look like necessity rather than escape. Einstein built the foundations of modern physics during the same years his family was falling apart. Rick builds civilizations, defeats galactic governments, and rewrites the laws of the universe during the same seasons where his daughter is quietly breaking under the weight of needing him. The work is real. The escape is also real. They are not two different things. Edward Einstein died in a psychiatric clinic in Zurich in 1965 at the age of 55. He had lived almost his entire adult life inside institutional walls, his mind damaged by the treatments meant to help him, his closest connection to the outside world cut off by geography and then by death, when first his father and then his mother were gone. The portrait of Sigmund Freud, the man whose work he had once hoped to build his own career on, apparently hung on the wall of his room in the clinic until the end. He had wanted to understand how the human mind worked. He spent his life as a case study in what happens when the people around you are brilliant at everything except being there. Beth Smith does not end up in a clinic. The show does not push the parallel that far, but she ends up in a cloning situation in season 4 and 5 that is itself a kind of searching. She looks at the possibility of there being two versions of herself and has to ask, honestly, which one of them is the real her? That question does not come from nowhere. It comes from a lifetime of being the daughter of someone so large and so absent that she has never been entirely sure what she is when he is not in the room. That is not a small kind of damage. It does not bleed. It does not show up in a diagnosis, but it is real, and it is directly traceable to a father who was the most capable person she had ever seen in her life and who could not manage the basic task of staying. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Einstein and Rick both left behind sons and daughters who were shaped by their absence in ways that no amount of afterward could fix. The letters, the money, the adventures, the Nobel Prize, none of it filled the specific hole that was left by the years the fathers were not there. The genius that could not save the marriage also could not save the children. And what comes next is darker still, because both men, in the years when they were failing the people closest to them, were also quietly making a much bigger mistake. A mistake that would not stay in the family. A mistake that would escape into the world and change it in ways neither of them meant and neither of them could take back. Section 3. The one great mistake every genius, at some point, makes a decision that is too big for one person to make. Not a mistake in the small sense. Not a wrong answer on a test or a calculation that comes out slightly off. The kind of mistake that starts inside one person's mind, gets put into motion by one person's hand, and then escapes into the world and becomes something no one can stop, control, or take back. The kind of mistake that, by the time the person who made it understands what they actually did, is already finished happening. Albert Einstein made that mistake on August 2nd, 1939, when he signed a letter addressed to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Rick Sanchez made that mistake in Season 1, Episode 6, when he handed Morty a love potion and told him to use it on a girl at school. The scale is different. One of these mistakes killed hundreds of thousands of people. One of these mistakes turned all of humanity into grotesque mutations and forced Rick and Morty to abandon their entire dimension forever. But the architecture underneath both mistakes is identical, and that architecture is what this section is about. Both men were the smartest person in the room. Both men made a unilateral decision, which means a decision made alone, without asking anyone else, without getting permission, without considering whether the people who would be affected by the outcome had any say in it. Both men were completely confident they understood what they were doing. Both men were wrong, in a way that the confidence made worse. And both men spent years afterward carrying the weight of something they could not undo and could not stop thinking about. In the summer of 1939, a physicist named Leo Szilard drove out to find Einstein on Long Island in New York, where Einstein was staying during the summer. Szilard was worried. German scientists had recently made a discovery about uranium that pointed toward the possibility of building an explosive device of almost unimaginable power. Szilard was Hungarian-born and had watched what was happening in Germany under the Nazi government. He was terrified that Germany might build this weapon before anyone else did. He needed Einstein's name on a letter to the President of the United States. Not Einstein's expertise in the actual science of the bomb. Not Einstein's involvement in any project to build it, just the name. Albert Einstein was, by 1939, the most famous scientist in the world. His name name on a piece of paper meant the paper would be read. When Szilard explained the possibility of the weapon to Einstein, Einstein's own response was telling. He said, in German, that he had not even thought about that. The man who had spent decades thinking about energy and matter and the relationship between the two had not followed the chain of logic all the way to its most dangerous conclusion. He had not seen it coming. He signed the letter anyway. The letter was delivered to President Roosevelt in October 1939. Roosevelt read it and acted on it. A committee was formed to study uranium. That committee eventually led to the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project produced the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb was dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The death toll from those two explosions ran into the hundreds of thousands. Einstein did not work on the Manhattan Project. He was not told about it. The United States government actually denied him security clearance to work on it in 1940, partly because of his public pacifist beliefs. He was not in the room when the decision was made to drop the bombs. He did not know until it was over. None of that changed how he felt about it. In a 1947 interview with Newsweek magazine, Einstein said that had he known the Germans would not succeed in developing an atomic bomb, he would never have lifted a finger. In his personal writings, he described signing the letter to Roosevelt as the one great mistake of his life. He wrote to his friend, the chemist Linus Pauling, and called it the greatest mistake he had ever made. He spent the last years of his life advocating for peace, for nuclear disarmament, for the idea that the weapon he had helped bring into the world needed to be controlled before it destroyed everything. He never stopped carrying it. He was not able to put it down. The man who said the words did not even think about that when Szilard first explained the bomb to him. Spent the rest of his life thinking about nothing else. Rick Sanchez, in the episode called Rick Potion Number 9, does something that is structurally the same thing at a completely different scale. Morty has a crush on a girl at school named Jessica. He wants her to like him. He asks Rick for help. Rick, without much hesitation and without thinking through the chain of consequences, gives Morty a love potion made from a compound taken from a vole, a small animal that mates for life. The idea is simple. Jessica drinks it. She falls for Morty. Done. Except Rick made the potion using flu season as a delivery mechanism. Jessica was already getting sick. The flu virus carries the compound. The compound spreads to everyone who catches the flu from Jessica. Within a very short time, everyone on Earth except Morty's immediate family members is completely, dangerously obsessed with Morty. Not fond of him, not interested in him. Dangerously, violently obsessed in a way that poses an immediate threat to everyone around them. Rick tries to fix it. His fix makes it worse. He uses DNA from a praying mantis to try to counteract the potion. Instead, it merges with the flu strain and causes every infected person to begin physically mutating into a hybrid creature. He tries again. That attempt combines with the previous mutations and turns the entire human population of Earth into horrifying creatures that the show calls Cronenbergs, after a filmmaker famous for movies about bodies transforming in disturbing ways. The Earth is gone. The people are gone. Rick and Morty's family is fine, standing in a house in the middle of a planet full of monsters, and Rick's solution is not to fix it. His solution is to find a universe where an alternate version of himself solved the problem, but then died immediately afterward, and to take that version's place. He and Morty travel to that dimension. They bury their own dead alternate bodies in the backyard. They go inside and pretend to be the versions of themselves who live there. The original dimension, the one with the Cronenbergs and the ruined Earth and the version of their family that is still alive and confused about where Rick and Morty went, is simply left behind. Rick does not apologize. He does not break down. He opens a beer and tells Morty to get over it. He acts like the thing that just happened was a minor inconvenience rather than the complete and permanent destruction of an entire world. But Morty does not get over it. There is a scene later in the same episode where Morty, sitting in the backyard of the new house next to the fresh graves he and Rick just dug, tells his sister Summer that Rick has more pain inside him than anyone can understand. That the thing that looks like not caring is actually a man who cares so much that he has had to build an entire personality around not showing it. That speech does not come from nowhere. It comes from a kid who just watched the smartest person he knows casually abandon an entire planet and pour himself a drink afterward. The thing that connects Einstein's letter and Rick's love potion is not just that both decisions went catastrophically wrong. Plenty of decisions go wrong. What connects them is the specific way they went wrong, and what both men did with that knowledge afterward. Einstein's letter went wrong because he made a massive decision affecting the entire world based entirely on his own judgment, without anyone else having meaningful input, without accounting for the full chain of what might happen, and with total confidence that he understood the situation well enough to act. The confidence was part of what made it dangerous. If he had been less certain, he might have asked more questions. He might have waited. He might might have considered the possibility that he was not seeing the whole picture. Rick's love potion went wrong for exactly the same reason. He heard what Morty wanted, ran the basic logic in his head, and handed over a solution without pausing long enough to think through what a love compound delivered through a flu virus might do at scale. He was so far ahead of the problem in terms of raw intelligence that he did not stop to run the scenario all the way to the end before acting. He skipped the part where you ask whether you should do the thing before you ask whether you can. Einstein's version of this is what his biographer Walter Isaacson identified clearly. Einstein did not just sign the letter. He was deeply involved in writing it, revising it, and deciding how to get it to the president. He was not a passive participant. He engaged fully, with all of his intelligence, and still did not trace the outcome far enough forward to see where it was going. Both men had more than enough ability to have seen further. They just did not look. What happened after, in both cases, is where the real difference between intelligence and wisdom shows up. Einstein spent the years after 1945 genuinely changed by what had happened. He became one of the loudest voices in the world calling for peace and for nuclear weapons to be brought under international control. He signed other letters, joined other causes, used the same famous name that had once helped bring the bomb into existence to try to contain the damage. He was not pretending. The regret was real, and it was deep, and it did not leave him. Rick, in the show, does not get the same kind of reckoning in that episode. He moves on. He buries the bodies and opens a beer and goes to the next thing. But the show does something more interesting than giving Rick a moment of visible regret. It distributes the weight of what happened across everything that comes after. The way Morty talks about Rick from that point forward is different. The way Rick holds himself when things get quiet is different. The Cronenberg dimension does not disappear from the conversation. It sits in the background of the whole show, the clearest possible evidence that Rick's intelligence has a cost that other people pay. Both men made a decision that was too big for one person to make. Both men made it alone, with confidence, and without fully accounting for what would happen when the thing they set in motion escaped their control. Neither of them was able to take it back. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And here's the part that the next section will unpack, because it is the strangest part of both stories. Even after the one great mistake, both men kept going. They did not stop. They found the next problem, the next theory, the next obsession. They poured themselves into something new with the same energy and the same confidence, as if the lesson of the mistake had not fully reached the part of them that actually made decisions. That is not stupidity. It is something more complicated, and it has a name. Section 4. The unfinished theory. There is a specific kind of suffering that only happens to people who are brilliant enough to see exactly what they are missing. Most people fail at things and do not fully understand why. The problem is too complex, the gap is too wide, the thing they are reaching for is too far away to even see clearly. The failure is frustrating, but it is also, in a certain way, bearable. You cannot grieve the precise shape of something you cannot fully picture. The suffering that belongs to the genuinely exceptional is different. Einstein could see exactly what he was trying to build. He could describe it. He could explain why it had to exist. He spent 30 years knowing with total clarity what the destination looked like and being completely unable to get there. Every failed attempt was not a mystery. It was a specific, measurable, undeniable confirmation that he was not getting there today. And then he got up and tried again tomorrow. Rick Sanchez spent multiple seasons of the show in the same position. He knew exactly who killed his wife. He knew exactly what he wanted to do when he found him. The destination was clear. The path was not. And the years of failing to reach it did to Rick what 30 years of failing to reach the unified field theory did to Einstein. It hollowed them both out. Not all at once. That is not how this kind of thing works. It happens slowly, across years, in the accumulation of days where the thing you have organized your entire life around does not come together. And in that slow hollowing, both men became less than what they started as, in the specific ways that matter most. In 1915, Albert Einstein finished the work that many people consider the greatest scientific achievement of any single human being in history. His general theory of relativity gave the world a completely new understanding of gravity, of space, and of time. It was not a small improvement on what came before, it was a total replacement. The understanding of the universe that humanity had operated on for over 200 years since Isaac Newton was revealed to be incomplete. Einstein showed what was actually going on underneath it. He was 36 years old when he finished it. The reasonable expectation, looking at that achievement from the outside, is that what came next would build on it, that Einstein would take what he had built and extend it further, go deeper, keep producing work at the same level or close to it. He was 36. He had decades ahead of him. If his 30s produced something that large, what would his 40s and 50s and 60s produce? The answer, and it is an uncomfortable one given the scale of the man, is not much. Not because because Einstein became lazy or stopped caring or lost his ability to think. He worked constantly until the very end of his life. He filled notebooks, he published papers, he corresponded with other scientists and engaged with new ideas and kept pushing. The effort was not the problem. The problem was that from roughly the early 1920s until he died in 1955, Einstein devoted almost all of that effort to a single project that never came together. He wanted to find what he called a unified field theory. The basic idea was this: he wanted one set of equations that could describe all of the forces in the universe under a single framework. He had already described gravity beautifully. He wanted to connect it with electromagnetism, the force that governs electricity and light and magnetism, into one complete picture of how everything worked. It sounds like exactly the kind of thing Einstein should have been able to do. It sounds like the natural next step after relativity. And for 30 years, he pursued it with everything he had. He never got there. Not close. Not a version that needed a little more work. In his 30-year search, Einstein never found anything that could be reasonably called a success. Every approach he tried eventually hit a wall. He would spend years building a framework, find a fatal problem in it, and start again from a different angle. The physics community around him moved forward, embraced new discoveries, developed quantum mechanics into a powerful and accurate description of how the smallest pieces of the universe behave. And Einstein increasingly refused to engage with any of it because it conflicted with his vision of what the final theory had to look like. By the time he died in April 1955, the man who had once been described by other physicists as a beacon, a person whose work pointed the whole field in the direction it needed to go, had become something else. The physicist Robert Oppenheimer, who led the Manhattan Project, said in 1948 that Einstein had become a landmark but not a beacon. A landmark is something you can see from a distance that tells you where you are. A beacon is something that lights the way forward. Oppenheimer was saying, carefully and with some sadness, that Einstein was still famous and still respected, but that the scientific community had largely moved past him. Einstein died with the unified field theory unfinished. The notebook he had been working in was on his hospital bed when he passed. He never stopped. He also never arrived. Rick Sanchez, across the run of Rick and Morty, has his own version of the unfinished theory. It is not an equation, it is a man. After Rick Prime murdered Diane and Beth in Rick's garage, Rick built his portal gun and went looking for him. This is the foundational fact of who Rick C-137 is. Every version of his nihilism, every drink he pours, every wall he builds around himself, every refusal to let anyone get close enough to matter to him, all of it traces back to that search. Rick Prime is the unified field theory of Rick's life, the one thing he has organized everything else around. The destination that gives the journey a direction, even when the journey is going nowhere. For most of the show's run, Rick does not find him. He searches across the multiverse. He develops technology to try to identify Rick Prime genetically and track him down. He builds the Citadel of Ricks, an entire civilization of alternate versions of himself, partly as a way to continue the hunt at a scale one person could not manage alone. He kills hundreds of versions of himself who might have been the one he was looking for. He keeps records. He keeps searching. And in the years of that failed search, something happens to Rick that is almost exactly what happened to Einstein across the years of the unified field theory. He gets further away from himself. Einstein, in the years of his search, became increasingly isolated from other physicists. He stopped engaging meaningfully with new work. He became rigid in a way that the younger Einstein never was. The man who had once been famous for his ability to look at a problem from an angle nobody else had tried gradually became someone who could only look at problems from the specific angle his theory required. The flexibility that had made general relativity possible was slowly replaced by an attachment to a framework that was not working. Rick, in the years of his failed search, does something parallel. He builds the central finite curve, a structure that limits the entire multiverse to only the dimensions where he is the smartest being alive. This is confirmed in the season 5 finale and further explained in later seasons. Rick, looking for control in a search that keeps slipping away from him, restructures reality itself so that at least one part of his world stays consistent. He will always be the smartest one in the room, even if he cannot find Rick Prime. Even if the thing he built his life around keeps failing to resolve, he can control that much. Einstein kept returning to his theory. Rick kept returning to his hunt. Both men, in the face of repeated failure, responded not by stepping back and asking whether the approach was wrong, but by doubling down, by going further in, by making the thing they were searching for even more central to their identity, so that the failure of the search felt like the failure of their entire reason for existing. That is not a choice. Exactly. It is what happens when a person has attached their sense of self too completely to an outcome they cannot guarantee. The search becomes the self. The unfinished theory becomes the personality. There is a moment in season Season 7 that is the clearest possible illustration of what the long search costs Rick. In the episode called Unmortrican, Rick finally finds Rick Prime. With the help of evil Morty, he tracks him down and kills him. The thing Rick has organized his entire existence around for the entire run of the show is done. The search is over. The revenge is complete, and Rick feels nothing. The show does not play this moment as triumph. It plays it as emptiness. Rick has spent so long running toward this destination that when he arrives, there is nothing waiting for him there. The grief that started the search is still there. Diane is still gone. Beth is still gone. Killing Rick Prime does not return them. It does not close the wound. It does not give Rick back the version of himself that existed before the bomb came through the portal. It just means the hunt is over. And the hunt, by that point, was the only reason Rick had left to keep moving. Einstein died still working on the unified field theory. He never reached the moment Rick reaches in Unmortrican, the moment of finishing and finding nothing there. But everyone who studied his later years closely noted the same thing the show is showing with Rick, that the search had become its own kind of prison, that the man was trapped inside an obsession that had started as a genuine intellectual mission and had gradually become something he could not put down, even when it was clear it was not working. Both men built their later lives on top of a project that could not be completed in the form they needed it to take. Both men kept working anyway. Both men found, or would have found, that the arrival was not the relief they had organized everything around expecting it to be. The unfinished theory is not really about physics or revenge. It is about what happens when a person uses a goal to hold themselves together. Einstein needed the unified field theory to be possible because a universe that could be fully described by a single coherent set of rules was a universe that made sense, a universe where his way of seeing things was ultimately correct. If the theory was impossible, something deeper was being asked of him that he did not have the answer to. Rick needed to find Rick Prime, because as long as the search continued, Rick had a reason to keep going. A reason that did not require him to sit with Diane's death in any quiet, honest, unmedicated way. The hunt was loud enough to drown out everything else. Both men were using an intellectual mission to survive an emotional reality they had never properly faced. And both men, when the mission consumed them fully, became less capable in the places that had nothing to do with the mission. Einstein became isolated. Rick became destructive. The work that was supposed to be the point of the life started eating the life instead. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What comes next in both stories is the part that most people find hardest to reckon with, because the isolation and the obsession and the failed theory are all things that happened inside the life of a genius. The next mistake went further out. It escaped into the world and stayed there, in a form neither man could have predicted and neither man could control. Section 5. The smartest man in the wrong room. There is a specific moment in most genius stories where the genius stops being the most interesting person in the conversation. It does not happen because they get less smart. The raw ability is still there. The processing speed, the pattern recognition, the capacity to hold complicated ideas at the same time and find the connections between them. All of that stays. What changes is the world around them. The world moves in a direction the genius did not expect and does not fully accept. And instead of moving with it, the genius plants their feet and insists that the world is wrong. From that moment forward, the genius is still brilliant. They are just brilliant in a room that has moved on without them. This is one of the most documented facts of Einstein's later life. It is also, with near perfect precision, the thing that the central finite curve in Rick and Morty is built to prevent. Both men understood, at some level, that being the smartest person in the room is not a permanent condition. Both men responded to that understanding in the same way, not by growing, not by staying flexible, by restructuring the room so that the condition could never change. That is not intelligence. That is fear dressed up as confidence. By the late 1920s, the physics community had developed something called quantum mechanics. The basic idea, stripped of everything that makes it technically complicated, is this. At the smallest level, the level of individual particles, the universe does not behave in a neat and predictable way. Things do not have fixed positions and speeds that you can simply measure and track. Instead, particles exist in a range of possible states at the same time, and you cannot know exactly what they are doing until you observe them directly. The universe, at its smallest level, is fundamentally uncertain. This was not a fringe idea. It was not a guess or a theory that needed more evidence. By the late 1920s, quantum mechanics was matching experimental results with extraordinary precision. Every test the physicists ran came back confirming it. The uncertainty was real. The randomness was built into the structure of reality at the deepest level anyone had been able to look. Einstein could not accept this. His objection was not not that the math was wrong. He understood the math. His objection was that the math could not be the final answer. A universe built on genuine randomness, where things happened without a fixed cause that could in theory be traced and understood, was a universe that violated something Einstein believed at a very deep level about how reality had to work. He famously said that he could not believe that God played dice, meaning he could not accept that the universe was fundamentally unpredictable at its core. He spent the rest of his life trying to prove that quantum mechanics was incomplete. He designed thought experiments, wrote papers, engaged in long debates with the physicist Niels Bohr and others who accepted the new framework. He was not passive about it. He brought enormous intelligence and creativity to the argument, and he lost. Not because the other scientists were better at arguing, because the experimental evidence kept coming in on the side of quantum mechanics and never on his side. The universe, as best as anyone could measure it, actually did play dice. The randomness was real. By the late 1930s and into the 1940s, Einstein had become genuinely isolated from the main conversation in physics. The people who had once seen him as the person pointing the whole field forward were now working on things he refused to engage with. His refusal was principled, and it was sincere, but the effect of it was the same as if it had been stubborn and petty. He was on the outside. Oppenheimer's description of Einstein as a landmark rather than a beacon was not unkind. It was honest. Einstein was still the most famous scientist in the world. His name still meant something enormous. But the work he was doing was not the work the field needed done, and the community of physicists largely knew it, even if they were too respectful to say it plainly. The smartest man in the world was in the wrong room, and instead of finding the right room, he built a better version of the room he was already in, and stayed there. Rick Sanchez did this literally. The central finite curve is one of the most important pieces of world building in Rick and Morty, and it does not get explained fully until the season 5 finale. The reveal, when it comes, is genuinely startling, because it reframes almost everything the show has done up to that point. Here is what it is. The multiverse in Rick and Morty contains an infinite number of parallel dimensions, each one slightly or dramatically different from the others. Among those infinite dimensions, there exists a subset, a specific collection of universes that share one particular feature. In every dimension inside the central finite curve, Rick Sanchez is the smartest being alive. Rick built it that way deliberately. The portal gun technology that Rick uses to travel between dimensions, and that the Citadel of Ricks runs on, only operates within the central finite curve. Every adventure the show has taken Rick and Morty on, every dimension they have visited, every alien civilization they have encountered, every version of themselves they have met, has existed within this carefully maintained bubble of reality where Rick is always, in every version of events, the most intelligent creature in the room. Every dimension where someone smarter than Rick might exist has been filtered out, excluded, made unreachable. Evil Morty, the show's most genuinely dangerous antagonist, understands this completely. In the season 5 finale, he destroys the central finite curve specifically because he sees it for what it is. He describes it as a prison. Not a prison that locks Rick in with bars and walls, a prison that Rick built for himself. One that looks like freedom because it gives him access to infinite worlds, but that is actually just an infinite repetition of the same condition. Rick is the smartest one. Rick is the most powerful one. Rick is the one who knows more than everyone else in the room. Evil Morty escapes the curve. He goes outside it, into the dimensions that Rick excluded, the ones where Rick would not automatically be exceptional. He goes where Rick refused to go, and the show frames this as the first genuine act of freedom the series has depicted, which is a damning piece of commentary on what the central finite curve actually represents. Put the two stories next to each other, and the mirror is almost uncomfortable to look at directly. Einstein, faced with a branch of physics that he could not master and could not accept, refused to engage with it on its own terms. He did not update his understanding of what the universe was. He maintained his existing framework and tried to make the new evidence fit inside it. The room he stayed in was the room where Einstein was right and the probabilistic universe was wrong. He lived in that room for the last 30 years of his life. Rick, faced with an infinite multiverse full of dimensions where he might not be the most capable being, built a filter that removed all of those dimensions from his accessible reality. The multiverse he traveled through was not the actual multiverse. It was a curated version of it, engineered to guarantee a specific outcome. The room Rick lived in was the room where Rick was always the smartest. He built walls around it and called it the universe. Both men were engaged in the same project, the project of making sure the world they operated in confirmed at every turn that they were who they believed themselves to be. This is not something that gets talked about when people discuss genius. The standard story of genius is about people brave enough to challenge the existing understanding, flexible enough to see what others miss, confident enough to push forward when the conventional wisdom says they are wrong. And that story is true for both Einstein Einstein and Rick in their greatest moments. What the standard story leaves out is what happens when the genius becomes the conventional wisdom, when the revolutionary becomes the establishment, when the person who was once the one challenging the room becomes the one the room needs to move past. Einstein was the person who proved Newton wrong. He was also, later, the person who could not accept that quantum mechanics was right. The same confidence that let him overturn 2 centuries of accepted physics made it nearly impossible for him to accept that something he had not developed might be more accurate than his own framework. Rick is the person who outsmarted the Galactic Federation, brought down the Council of Ricks, and defeated threats that entire civilizations could not handle. He is also the person who quietly built a version of reality guaranteed to keep him at the top of it. The same intelligence that makes him capable of anything makes him unable to tolerate the possibility that somewhere out there, something might be capable of more. There is a version of this pattern that is easy to sympathize with because it comes from a real and understandable place. Einstein's resistance to quantum mechanics was not simply stubbornness. It came from a deeply held belief that the universe had to be coherent and consistent at every level. That randomness at the foundation of reality was philosophically unacceptable because it left the universe with no firm ground to stand on. That belief was wrong in its conclusion, but it was not irrational. It came from the same place that had produced his greatest work, a refusal to accept that the universe was messier than it had to be. Rick's central finite curve came from grief and exhaustion and decades of searching for something he could not find. A man who has lost everything and spent years being unable to fix it is a man who has very good personal reasons for wanting to control at least one thing. The thing he chose to control was the one variable he had always been able to rely on, his own superiority. If he could not find Rick Prime, could not save Diane, could not undo the damage of every mistake, he could at least be the smartest one. He could at least be sure of that. The sympathy is real. The cost of the choice is also real. Einstein's refusal to accept quantum mechanics meant that the last 30 years of his scientific life produced almost nothing that moved the field forward. The greatest mind of the 20th century spent 3 decades being wrong in an increasingly lonely and isolated way, and physics had to continue without him. Rick's central finite curve meant that every adventure he took, every problem he solved, every moment of genuine connection he had with Morty and his family happened inside a bubble he had engineered to protect his ego. The freedom was fake. The superiority was guaranteed in advance. And when evil Morty destroyed the curve and the real multiverse opened up, Rick had nothing. No portal gun, no guaranteed advantage. Just a man, suddenly exposed to a universe that had not been arranged around him. That is the thing about building a room to stay the smartest person in. Eventually, the room runs out of walls. __quote _ _4 __. What comes next in both stories is the hardest part to look at, because it is not about isolation or obsession or ego. It is about the specific, irreversible damage both men did to the people they were closest to. The people who did not sign up to be part of a genius's story, but ended up inside it anyway, paying a price they never agreed to pay. Section 6. The Nobel Irony. There is something quietly devastating about being celebrated for the wrong thing. Not wrong in the sense of undeserved, not wrong in the sense of dishonest, wrong in the sense that the thing the world decides to remember about you, the thing that gets written on the award and repeated in the speeches and printed in the newspapers, turns out to be a smaller version of what you actually were. The world picks the part of you it can most easily understand and holds it up as the whole picture, and you have to stand there and accept the applause for a version of yourself that is technically accurate and fundamentally incomplete. Albert Einstein won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1921. He won it for his explanation of the photoelectric effect. That is the official reason, written in the official record, repeated every time the prize is mentioned. Not for the special theory of relativity, which changed how humanity understood space and time. Not for the general theory of relativity, which changed how humanity understood gravity and the structure of the universe. For the photoelectric effect. The Nobel Committee, during the selection process in 1921, decided that none of the nominations that year met the criteria for the prize. They held the award and gave it the following year instead, in 1922. The reason relativity was not recognized was partly because the committee considered it too philosophically controversial and too difficult to verify experimentally to the standard they required. So they gave him the prize for something smaller, something they could point to and say, here is the specific discovery, here is the specific thing that was tested and confirmed. Einstein did not attend the ceremony. He was traveling in Japan at the time. Rick Sanchez has his own version of this. His most famous moment in the cultural memory of the show is not the scene where he dismantled the Galactic Federation from inside a prison cell. It is not the moment he restructured the multiverse. It is not any of the genuinely staggering things he has done across 7 seasons that demonstrate a level of intelligence so far beyond any real-world comparison that the Einstein parallel actually starts to feel modest. His most famous moment is turning himself into a pickle. Pickle Rick. The 3rd episode of Season 3 became one of the most referenced and repeated moments in the show's entire history, almost immediately after it aired. The image of Rick as a small green pickle, the clip of him announcing it, the way it spread across the internet and became the thing millions of people associated with Rick and Morty when they had not actually watched it, all of that happened fast and stayed. The irony in both cases runs in the same direction. The world grabbed the most accessible, most repeatable, most surface-level version of both men and turned it into the defining image. Einstein becomes the funny hair and the equation and the tongue. Rick becomes the pickle. The actual depth underneath both images gets buried under the version that fits on a poster or spreads easily online. But the irony goes deeper than just image management, because in both cases, the thing the world celebrated most loudly turns out, on closer inspection, to be evidence of something the person would probably rather not be examined. Einstein winning the Nobel Prize for the photoelectric effect, rather than for relativity, is, on the surface, a story about institutional caution. The committee was not ready to recognize something as radical as relativity. They went with what they could defend. That is the standard explanation. What gets less attention is the specific thing the photoelectric effect contributed to. Einstein's explanation of it was a foundational moment in the development of quantum mechanics. The paper he wrote in 1905 describing how light behaves as individual packets of energy, which is what the photoelectric effect required to make sense, was one of the key early steps toward the quantum picture of the universe that Einstein would later spend 30 years refusing to fully accept. He won his highest honor for helping to start something he eventually fought against. The prize, in other words, celebrated Einstein for a contribution whose full implications he was not willing to follow all the way to their conclusion. He helped open the door that quantum mechanics walked through, and then spent the rest of his life insisting the door should not have been opened in that direction. The Nobel Committee, by choosing that specific paper, accidentally commemorated the version of Einstein that was still open, still flexible, still willing to let the evidence take him somewhere unexpected. That version of Einstein did not last, but the prize did. Pickle Rick functions the same way in the show's internal logic, and the show is aware of it. The episode is built around Rick turning himself into a pickle to avoid family therapy. The official reason he gives is that he did it because he can, because he wanted to, because the sheer fact that it is possible makes it worth doing. He presents it as an act of pure genius and freedom. The world received it largely that way. The pickle is funny. The action sequences that follow, where Rick engineers a way to move and survive as a small vegetable in a sewer, and then fights his way through an entire government facility, are genuinely impressive in terms of what they show about how his mind works under pressure. Then the episode's therapist, Dr. Wong, delivers the speech that the episode has been building toward the whole time. She tells Rick, in calm and precise terms, that what she sees when she looks at his behavior is not freedom. She sees a man who is so afraid of the ordinary work of being a person, of sitting with his family and talking honestly about what is going wrong, that he would rather turn himself into a vegetable. She tells him that the intelligence he uses to avoid these situations is real, and that he will probably always be able to find a way out of any room he does not want to be in. And then she says something that lands differently every time you hear it. She says that the real question is whether an intelligent man choosing to be a pickle is a gift or a waste. Rick has no answer. He sits there and takes the speech without deflecting, which is the most honest thing he does in the entire episode. The show, in other words, takes its own most celebrated moment and uses the episode itself to diagnose what that moment actually means. The pickle is not a triumph, it is a symptom. The thing that became the defining meme of the show, the image that spread everywhere and that millions of people cheered as proof of Rick's genius, is the show's clearest example of intelligence being used as a tool for avoidance. Einstein's Nobel Prize paper is not a symptom in the same clinical sense, but it is, in retrospect, a document of the last moment before Einstein's thinking calcified into something he could not update. The 1905 paper is Einstein at his most open. It is Einstein following the evidence into strange territory and accepting what he finds there. The fact that the Nobel Committee chose that paper, of all his work, to put the highest honor on, is the fact that they permanently commemorated the quality that Einstein was slowest to lose and most costly when he finally did. Both of these ironies share an underneath. The world, when it celebrates a genius, tends to celebrate the output, the equation, the discovery, the moment. It tends not to celebrate the internal state that produced the output, partly because that internal state is messy messier and harder to pin down, and not as easily put on a poster. What made Einstein capable of the photoelectric effect paper was a willingness to look at a problem that nobody else had solved, accept that the existing explanations were not good enough, and follow a new idea into territory that had no guaranteed outcome. That willingness is a character quality, not just an intellectual one. It requires a specific kind of courage that has nothing to do with being unafraid, and everything to do with being willing to be wrong on the way to being right. The Nobel Prize celebrated the result of that quality. It did not and could not celebrate the quality itself. What makes Rick capable of the things the show shows him doing is not just processing speed or a memory full of scientific knowledge. It is the same underlying quality. The willingness to go into a situation without a guaranteed exit and trust that his mind will find a way through. That quality is real, and it is remarkable. And it is also, the show keeps showing, the same quality that lets him walk away from things he should stay for. The mind that can get out of any room is also the mind that leaves rooms it should not leave. The celebrated version of Rick, the one on the t-shirts and the memes and in the cultural shorthand people use when they talk about the show, is the pickle version. The version that is impressive and funny and at a comfortable distance from anything painful. The actual Rick, the one the show is building episode by episode, is Dr. Wong's version, a man with more capability than almost any being in the universe, using that capability primarily to avoid the things that scare him most. The Nobel Committee gave Einstein a prize for work that contained, quietly inside it, the seed of the argument he would spend the rest of his life losing. The internet gave Rick his most famous moment for an act that his therapist correctly identified as a symptom of his deepest dysfunction. Both men were celebrated loudly for exactly the wrong thing, and in both cases, the celebration made it easier to avoid looking at what was actually going on underneath. The prize and the meme both function as a kind of armor. As long as Einstein has a Nobel Prize and Rick has a famous pickle episode, the conversation tends to stay on the surface. The funny hair, the green vegetable, the equation on the board. Clean images that do not require you to look at the son in the clinic, or the wife who got bombed out of existence, or the 30 years of failed work, or the multiverse built to protect an ego that was never as invulnerable as it looked. Both men were more than the image. The image was, in both cases, selected specifically because it was easier to hold than the truth. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 5, underscore, underscore. What comes next is the truth that both images were built to cover, not the mistake or the failure or the isolation. The part that is harder than any of those, because it is not about what either man did wrong. It is about what both men built, how far it traveled, and the fact that by the time anyone understood the full scale of what had been created, it was already far too late to bring it back under control. Section 7. The weapons they unleashed. There is a difference between building something and releasing something. Building is controlled. You decide what it is, how it works, where it goes, when it stops. The thing you build stays connected to your intentions. You can modify it, redirect it, take it apart if it goes wrong. The thing you build is yours in a real sense because the outcome is still within reach of the person who started it. Releasing is different. Releasing is the moment the thing leaves your hands and becomes its own fact in the world. It does not care anymore about what you intended. It does not carry your regrets forward with it. It does not slow down because you changed your mind. Once something is released at a large enough scale, the person who released it becomes almost irrelevant to what happens next. They are just the origin point. The thing itself has taken over. Both Albert Einstein and Rick Sanchez built something that started as a personal tool and became, once it left their hands, a force that neither of them could control, direct, or stop. Both men watched what they created escape them. Both men spent years afterward living in the shadow of something they started that the world then ran with in directions they never planned for and could not reverse. The scale of the two things is different. One is real and killed hundreds of thousands of people. One is fictional and reshaped an entire multiverse. But the mechanism is the same. The personal decision, the creation that escaped, the consequence that outlived the creator's ability to manage it. Einstein's letter to President Roosevelt, signed on August 2nd, 1939, is one of the most consequential single documents in the history of the modern world. The letter was primarily written by the physicist Leo Szilard. Einstein's contribution was his name. That was enough. Roosevelt received the letter and acted on it. An advisory committee on uranium was formed. That committee eventually fed into the full development program that became the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project, running from 1942 onward, employed hundreds of thousands of people across dozens of locations across the United States. It was the largest scientific and military undertaking in American history up to that point. Its purpose was to build an atomic bomb before Nazi Germany could. Germany surrendered in May 1945. The bomb was not ready in time to be used against against Germany. It was used instead against Japan. On August 6, 1945, the bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. The total number of people killed by both bombs, both immediately and in the months that followed from radiation and injuries, is estimated to be somewhere between 129,000 and 226,000 people. Einstein was not involved in the Manhattan Project. He had been denied security clearance in 1940 because the government considered his pacifist beliefs a security risk. He did not know the bombs were being built at the scale they were being built. He did not know they were going to be dropped on Japanese cities. He found out when it was over, the same way most of the world did. He was, by every technical and legal measure, not responsible for the decision to use the bombs. He also could not stop thinking about it for the rest of his life. What he had done was sign the document that started the chain. He had not built the bomb, he had not dropped it, he had not ordered its use, but he had put his name on a letter that set a process in motion, and that process had produced something that killed over 100,000 people in 2 days. The chain that started with his signature had traveled to a place he never intended it to go, through hands he had no control over, arriving at an outcome he found genuinely horrifying. After the war, Einstein became one of the most prominent voices in the world calling for nuclear disarmament. He co-signed documents calling for international cooperation to control nuclear weapons. He spoke publicly about the danger of what had been created. He used the same famous name that had helped start the Manhattan Project to argue that the weapons it produced needed to be contained before they destroyed everything. He called the letter to Roosevelt the one great mistake of his life. He wrote this in his personal correspondence and said it in interviews. He said that had he known Germany was never close to building a bomb, he would have done nothing. He meant it. The regret was genuine. The damage was also permanent. Both things were true at the same time, and neither one canceled the other out. Rick Sanchez's equivalent is the portal gun. This is the device that defines Rick more than anything else in the show. The green portal gun that lets him step through a circular opening and arrive somewhere else entirely, somewhere in a different dimension or a different part of the universe. It is the most recognizable piece of technology in Rick and Morty, and it is, in the show's internal logic, the most consequential invention in the history of the multiverse. Rick did not build the portal gun casually. He built it out of grief. After Rick Prime murdered Diane and Beth in the garage of Rick's home, Rick C-137 spent years trying to figure out how to travel between dimensions so he could find the man who took his family. Every other Rick in the multiverse who developed portal technology did so because another Rick showed them how. Rick C-137 is, as the show confirms across its later seasons, one of the only versions of himself to develop the technology independently. He built it from scratch, driven entirely by the need to find Rick Prime, powered by the specific grief of a man who watched his wife and daughter die in front of him and had nothing left to lose. The portal gun was personal. It was a tool of revenge. It was the thing he built for himself, for one specific purpose, in the aftermath of the worst moment of his life. Then it escaped. Other Ricks across the multiverse had also developed portal technology. Eventually, thousands of versions of Rick came together and formed the Citadel of Ricks, the interdimensional society that runs on portal technology and serves as the organizational structure for a civilization of alternate selves. Rick C-137 was central to the founding of the Citadel. The portal gun went from being one man's instrument of personal revenge to being the infrastructure of an entire civilization. The Citadel, as the show reveals across multiple seasons, is not a good place. It replicates every hierarchy and exploitation and corruption that exists in any society. Except here, the people doing the exploiting are all versions of Rick, and the people being exploited are all versions of Morty. It is a civilization built on the technology Rick created for the most personal possible reason, running in ways that Rick never intended and that he has almost no control over by the time the show is exploring it in depth. In Season 3, the episode called The Ricklantis Mix-Up shows the Citadel in detail for the first time. What it shows is a society where working-class Ricks are trapped in dead-end factory jobs, and ordinary Mortys are treated as second-class people with no real future. The technology Rick built to chase down the man who murdered his family has become the foundation of a system of inequality and exploitation at a multiversal scale. Rick did not build that. He built a portal gun for a personal purpose. What the portal gun became is a different thing entirely, shaped by all the hands it passed through after it left his. There is a further layer to this that the show makes explicit in the Season 5 finale and beyond. The central finite curve, which Rick built as a way of maintaining his position as the smartest being in every accessible dimension, was only possible because of the portal gun technology. The curve is maintained through the portal network. Every Rick's portal gun, within the Citadel system, only opens to dimensions inside the curve. The personal revenge tool became the civilization infrastructure, and the civilization infrastructure became the cage. Evil Morty's destruction of the central finite curve in the Season 5 finale requires him to hack not just one portal gun, but the entire portal network that the Citadel runs on. He converts the Citadel itself into a device capable of breaking through the curve. The thing Rick built to find one man has become so embedded in the structure of the multiverse that destroying even part of its infrastructure is a multiversal event. Portals malfunction across all dimensions simultaneously. Realities begin to bleed into each other. The damage is widespread and immediate. Rick, watching this happen, cannot stop it. The thing he built has grown so far beyond him that he is just a person standing in the middle of it. No more able to control the outcome than Einstein was able to control what the military did with the atomic bomb once it existed. The parallel between these two stories is precise enough to be almost uncomfortable to trace. Einstein created a letter. The letter created a committee. The committee created a project. The project created a bomb. The bomb was used by people Einstein had no authority over, in a way Einstein did not sanction, on a target Einstein was not consulted about. By the time the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, Einstein's original intention, which was to prevent Nazi Germany from getting there first, was not even relevant anymore. The thing had moved so far from his hands that his original purpose was almost beside the point. Rick created a portal gun. The portal gun created a technology. The technology created a civilization. The civilization created a cage. The cage was maintained by a portal network that Rick had no meaningful control over, running on rules and hierarchies he never intended, serving purposes that had nothing to do with why he built the original device. By the time Evil Morty blew the whole structure open in the Season 5 finale, Rick's original intention, finding Rick Prime, was buried so deep under layers of unintended consequence that it was barely visible. Both men built something personal that became something enormous. Both men watched it travel beyond their ability to guide it. Both men were left holding the origin story of something the world had taken ownership of. The difference between Einstein and Rick on this specific point is one of self-awareness. Einstein named what happened clearly and without softening it. He called it his greatest mistake. He was publicly and privately honest about the gap between what he intended and what he caused. Rick, characteristically, does not do this. He does not name it. He moves forward. He finds the next problem. He builds the next thing. The portal gun and what it became and what the Citadel did with it, and how the central finite curve trapped an infinite number of versions of reality, Rick carries all of that forward without fully sitting with what it means. But the show sits with it. The show names it for him through Evil Morty's speech, through the destruction of the curve, through the image of Rick standing in the wreckage of something he started that grew into something he could not manage. Both men built a weapon. Both weapons escaped. Both men spent the rest of their lives in the aftermath. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What neither story fully prepares you for is what comes next, because the weapons and the consequences and the regrets are all things that happened in the world, visible and measurable and at least possible to point to and name. The next part of both stories happens somewhere harder to see. It happens in the specific, private, quietly ruinous way both men treated the people who chose to get close to them, the people who were not part of the big historical story, but who paid some of the highest prices in it. Section 8. The relationship they destroyed to do the work. There is a kind of person who is very easy to love from a distance. From a distance, everything about them is impressive. The intelligence, the capability, the way they move through problems that would stop anyone else cold. From a distance, you see the results without the cost. You see what they build without watching what gets torn down to build it. You see the finished version of the person without sitting in the room where the people closest to them are quietly absorbing the damage. Get close enough and the picture changes. Not because the intelligence disappears, not because the capability stops being real, but because the same qualities that make someone extraordinary at the large scale tend to make them very difficult at the small scale. The focus that produces great work tends to consume everything around it. The emotional distance that lets a person function inside enormous pressure tends to make ordinary human closeness feel impossible. The person who can handle anything the universe throws at them often cannot handle a conversation about how the people at their kitchen table are actually feeling. Albert Einstein had one person in his life who came closest to being his genuine equal, not just as a companion, but as an intellectual partner. That person was his first wife, Mileva Merrick. Rick Sanchez had one person who could reach him in ways nobody else in the show ever managed to. That person was Diane. Both men had that person. Both men lost them. And the way both men handled the loss, and the way the loss shaped everything that came after, is one of the most honest things either story has to offer about what it actually costs to be built the way both of them were built. Mileva Merrick was not simply Einstein's wife. Before she was his wife, she was his classmate. She studied physics at the Zurich Polytechnic Institute at a time when women were almost entirely excluded from serious scientific education. She was one of the very few exceptions. She was serious, rigorous, and capable at a level that the institution around her largely refused to acknowledge simply because of who she was. Einstein was drawn to her immediately, and the early letters between them make clear why. She was one of the only people he had ever met who could follow what he was thinking in real time, who could engage with his ideas as a participant rather than an audience, who pushed back when she disagreed and matched him when he went deep into something complicated. He wrote to her about physics and about love in the same letters, as if the two things were inseparable for him, which at that point in his life they probably were. They built something together in those early years. Not just a relationship, a partnership. The letters suggest a genuine back and forth about ideas, a collaboration that meant something to both of them. Einstein later described those years, the years before the marriage fell apart, as the happiest of his scientific life. Then the marriage became a different thing. The success started, the positions at universities, the recognition from other scientists, the growing sense that Einstein was not just another promising young physicist, but something genuinely exceptional. As the recognition grew, the partnership shifted. Einstein moved toward the center of the scientific world. Mileva moved toward the edge of his attention. She had given up her own scientific ambitions to raise their children and manage their household. The collaboration that had felt equal in the early letters became something that looked increasingly like one person supporting another person's career while their own quietly disappeared. By the time Einstein began his affair with his cousin Elsa in 1912, the marriage had been hollow for years. Mileva found out about the affair in 1914 when the family moved to Berlin. She took the children and went back to Zurich. She never really recovered from the marriage or from what came after it. She spent years raising two sons largely alone, managing Eduard's devastating illness with very little support, surviving on money that Einstein sent and later on money from his Nobel Prize, which he had promised her as part of their divorce settlement. She died in 1948 in Zurich, having outlived her usefulness to Einstein's story by several decades in the minds of most people who told it. Einstein moved forward. He married Elsa. He became the most famous scientist in the world. He gave lectures and received awards and corresponded with leaders and thinkers across the globe. He did not stop. The work continued. The life continued. But in his private letters and his more honest moments, something else is visible. Einstein writing about Mileva in later years is not the writing of a man who has cleanly moved on. It is the writing of a man who understood, too late to change anything, that he had dismantled the one relationship in his life that had offered him something irreplaceable. Not just companionship, not just support, the specific kind of being known that only happens when someone understands not just what you think, but how you think, and loves you anyway. After Mileva, Einstein had relationships and a second marriage and many connections. He did not have that again. Diane is not on screen in Rick and Morty for very long. She appears in memories, in fragments, in the pieces of Rick's past that the show slowly reveals across multiple seasons. She does not give long speeches or have fully developed storylines of her own. The show presents her mostly through the shape of her absence, through what Rick became after she was gone, through the behaviors and defenses and addictions that all trace back to the garage where she died. But what the show does show, in the moments it allows, is a Diane who was not simply someone Rick loved. She was someone who could reach him. In the memories and the context the show builds around her, Diane is presented as the person for whom Rick was willing to be ordinary. He was content in that life, not conquering the multiverse, not outsmarting galactic governments, just a scientist in a garage with a wife and a daughter, happy in a way that required nothing extraordinary. That version of Rick, the one who was happy with ordinary things, only existed because of Diane. She was not the background of his story. She was the condition that made a different kind of Rick possible. The Rick who did not need to be the smartest one in every room. The Rick who did not need to prove anything. The Rick who could sit at a kitchen table and just be there. When Rick Prime murdered Diane, that version of Rick died with her. What came after was the Rick the show gives you for 7 seasons. The drinking, the nihilism, the walls, the refusal to let anyone matter to him at a level that could hurt him the way losing Diane hurt him. He did not replace her. He made a decision, somewhere in the long years of his grief, that he was never going to be in a position to lose someone like that again. The cost of that decision was everything. The closeness that Diane made possible, the willingness to be known, the capacity to be present in an ordinary moment without needing it to be something larger. All of it went away and did not come back. In season 5, when the character Mr. Nimbus meets Rick and mentions Diane by name during an argument, Rick's reaction is immediate and and total. He does not deflect. He does not make a joke. He goes into a rage that is entirely out of proportion to the moment, and the show frames that reaction clearly. The name alone, in the mouth of someone else, is more than Rick can handle. He has built an entire personality to keep that pain at a distance, and one word from an old acquaintance almost brings the whole structure down. The show, in that moment, is telling you something very direct. Rick is not over it. Rick has never been over it. Every version of the swagger and the genius and the interdimensional adventure is a structure built on top of a wound that never healed because Rick never let it. He buried it under enough forward motion that most days he does not have to feel it, but it is there. It was always there. The parallel between Einstein and Mileva and Rick and Diane is not just that both men lost the person who mattered most to them. It is how both men responded to the loss and what the response cost them in every relationship that came after. Einstein, after Mileva, was capable of warmth and connection and genuine affection. He was not a cold person, but the specific quality of that early partnership, the meeting of equals, the sense of being known rather than simply admired, never came back in the same form. The relationships he had afterward were real, but they were different. Elsa was devoted to him. He described their marriage as a union of convenience. He had people around him constantly for the rest of his life. He was not lonely in the ordinary sense, but there is a specific kind of aloneness that has nothing to do with how many people are in the room, and Einstein carried that with him. Rick, after Diane, is the show's clearest portrait of the same thing. He is surrounded by family, by Morty, by Summer, by Beth, by the constant chaos of interdimensional life. He is never literally alone. But the show keeps returning to the image of Rick as fundamentally unreachable. The people who love him can get close, but not all the way. There is a distance he maintains that nobody can fully cross, not because he does not want connection, but because connection at that level means vulnerability at that level, and vulnerability at that level means the possibility of the kind of loss he has already survived once and built his entire subsequent life around never surviving again. Both men destroyed the relationship that made them most human, one through choices made over years, one through a loss that was not his fault but that he never recovered from. And both men spent the rest of their lives being remarkable and impressive and surrounded by people while carrying, underneath all of it, the specific absence of the one relationship that had made them capable of being simply themselves. The intelligence did not protect them from this. In some ways, it made it worse. Because the same mind that can outthink any problem in the universe can also construct extraordinarily convincing reasons why the walls are necessary, and the distance is appropriate, and the numbness is wisdom. Both men were very smart about being unavailable. The people around them paid the price. But the price that was paid closest to home, quietly and without the drama of bombs or multiversal collapse, is only part of what this story costs. The next part is about what both men did when the universe itself, not just the people in their lives, but reality at the most fundamental level, refused to behave the way their intelligence told them it had to. Section 9. The addiction to being right, there is a version of certainty that looks like strength and functions like a cage. From the outside, it looks like confidence. The person who has it moves through the world without hesitation. They do not second-guess themselves in public. They do not show the wobble that most people show when the ground shifts under them. They have a framework for understanding how things work, and when new information comes in that does not fit the framework, they do not update the framework. They find a reason why the new information is wrong. This is not stupidity. That is the important thing to understand before anything else in this section. Stupidity would be easier to explain and easier to fix. What this actually is something that lives right next to intelligence and is almost impossible to separate from it once it has taken hold. It is the addiction to being right, the deep structural need to have the world confirm what you already believe about it. Because the alternative, discovering that your most fundamental assumptions were wrong, feels less like a correction and more like a collapse. Albert Einstein had this addiction at the level of physics. He could not accept that the universe was built on genuine randomness at its deepest level, and he spent 30 years insisting the evidence was incomplete rather than updating what he believed. Rick Sanchez has this addiction at the level of everything. He cannot accept that caring about people is survivable, that vulnerability is not the same as weakness, that the nihilism he built after Diane died is a choice he is making rather than a truth he discovered. And the show, across 7 seasons, keeps showing him the evidence that his framework is wrong, and keeps showing him finding ways not to fully absorb it. Both men were addicted to a specific picture of how reality worked. Both men kept running into evidence that the picture was incomplete. Neither man could put the picture down. Einstein's relationship with quantum mechanics is one of the most documented scientific disagreements in history, and it is worth being precise about what it actually was, because the shorthand version leaves out the most important part. Einstein did not simply dislike quantum mechanics. He had helped create it. His 1905 paper on the photoelectric effect, the one that won him the Nobel Prize, was a foundational contribution to the early development of quantum theory. He understood it deeply. He could work with the mathematics. He was not confused by it in the way a less capable person might be confused by something genuinely difficult. His objection was more specific and more philosophical than simple dislike. The Copenhagen interpretation, which became the mainstream accepted understanding of quantum mechanics, said that a particle does not have a fixed position or a fixed speed until it is measured. Before measurement, it exists in a range of possible states at the same time. The act of observing it is what causes it to settle into one specific state. The randomness is not a gap in our knowledge that better measurement could fill. The randomness is real, and it is built into the structure of reality itself. Einstein found this philosophically unacceptable. His famous phrase, that God does not play dice, was not a religious statement. It was a statement about determinism, about the belief that every event in the universe has a cause that, in theory, could be traced and understood. A universe built on genuine randomness is a universe where some things happen for no traceable reason. Einstein believed, at a level deeper than any single experiment could touch, that this could not be true. That if you looked deep enough, there had to be something underneath the randomness that explained it. Hidden rules that the current theory was not yet capable of seeing. He was not alone in this. Several serious physicists shared versions of his concern. The debates he had with Niels Bohr at the major physics conferences of the late 1920s and 1930s are some of the most intense intellectual exchanges ever recorded between two people at the top of their field. Einstein would arrive with a new thought experiment designed to show a weakness in the Copenhagen interpretation. Bohr would spend the night working on it and come back the next day with a response that addressed the problem. This happened repeatedly over years. By most accounts, Bohr won the argument, not by being a better debater, by being on the side of every experiment that anyone ran. The evidence kept coming back, confirming the quantum picture of the universe and not confirming Einstein's alternative. The randomness was real. The uncertainty was built in. God, as best as anyone could measure, actually did play dice. Einstein kept going. He could not stop. Even when the experimental evidence was overwhelming, even when the physics community had largely moved on and accepted the quantum framework as the working foundation of the field, Einstein was still writing papers arguing that it had to be incomplete, still designing thought experiments, still insisting that the hidden rules existed even though nobody could find them. The addiction was not to a specific theory, it was to a specific picture of what the universe had to be. And that picture was so central to how Einstein understood everything, including his own work, that abandoning it would have required him to rebuild something that went all the way down to the foundation. He could not do it. He kept the picture. He kept arguing. The physics kept proving him wrong. He kept getting up the next day and arguing again. Rick Sanchez's version of this addiction runs through the entire show, but it is most visible in the specific moments where the show lets the mask slip and then watches Rick put it back on. The framework Rick operates from, the one he states loudly in the early seasons and that the show keeps interrogating, is nihilism. Nothing matters. The universe is vast and indifferent, and the idea that any individual life or relationship or feeling has genuine significance is a story people tell themselves to get through the day. Rick presents this not as a choice, but as the logical conclusion of being smart enough to see clearly. The implication is that if you were as intelligent as Rick, you would arrive at the same place. Caring is for people who have not thought it through hard enough. The show, from very early on, demonstrates that this framework is wrong as a description of how Rick actually functions. He consistently acts in ways that contradict it. He saves Morty when he could walk away. He feels genuine rage when the people he cares about are threatened. He builds elaborate structures, the Citadel, the central finite curve, his entire approach to adventure, that only make sense if the people inside them matter to him enormously. A man who genuinely believed nothing mattered would not work this hard. The effort itself is the evidence. The most precise version of this is in the episode Pickle Rick in Season 3. Dr. Wong, the therapist Rick goes to extraordinary lengths to avoid seeing, delivers a speech that is essentially a clinical description of Rick's addiction to his own framework. She tells him that the issue is not his intelligence. She tells him that the problem is that he has decided the work of being a person, the ordinary, difficult work of sitting with other people and being honest and vulnerable and present, is beneath him. And she says that using intelligence to avoid that work is not strength. It is fear given a very convincing disguise. Rick cannot argue with her. He is, as noted in an earlier section, smart enough to know she is right. But being smart enough to know something is true and being willing to act on that knowledge are two completely different things. Rick knows his nihilism is not accurate. He knows that the framework he built after Diane died is a coping structure rather than a genuine philosophy. He knows that caring about Morty and Beth and Summer contradicts everything he says about nothing mattering. He keeps the framework framework anyway. He keeps it for the same reason Einstein kept his picture of the universe. Because the alternative is not just admitting you were wrong about a theory. The alternative is rebuilding something that goes all the way to the foundation of who you are. Einstein built his entire scientific identity on the belief that the universe was ultimately deterministic and knowable. Accepting quantum mechanics fully would have meant accepting that his deepest instinct about reality was incorrect. That is not a small adjustment. That is a different kind of person. Rick built his entire post-Diane identity on the belief that nothing matters and no connection is worth the risk it carries. Accepting that this is wrong, accepting what Dr. Wong is telling him, would mean acknowledging the grief he has never properly felt, the vulnerability he has spent decades armoring against, the possibility that the people around him could genuinely hurt him the way Diane's death hurt him. That is not a small adjustment either. That is a completely different way of being alive. What makes the addiction to being right so durable in both men is that it is partially correct, which is the most dangerous kind of wrong. Einstein was right that quantum mechanics as understood in his time had unresolved problems. He was right that the Copenhagen interpretation had philosophical gaps that even its supporters acknowledged. He was right that a deeper and more complete theory probably existed underneath what had been found so far. He was not wrong about any of that. He was wrong about the conclusion he drew from it, which was that the randomness had to be illusory and that hidden rules had to explain it. The problems were real. His solution was not. Rick's nihilism is the same structure. He is right that the universe is vast and largely indifferent to individual human concerns. He is right that most of the stories people tell themselves about meaning and purpose and connection are partly constructed, are ways of making sense of something that does not inherently have sense built into it. He is not wrong about any of that. He is wrong about the conclusion, which is that this means nothing is worth caring about. The premises are defensible, the conclusion does not actually follow from them. Both men built a cage out of something that was partially true. That is what makes the cage so hard to leave. If it were entirely wrong, it would be easier to walk out of. The partial truth gives it walls that feel solid. The partial truth makes every attempt to question the framework feel like an attack on something reasonable rather than an invitation to look more carefully. Both men spent years inside those cages. Both men were smart enough to see the lock from the inside. Neither man opened the door. Quote 8 The last section of this story is about what happens when the door finally gets forced open from outside. When the thing both men spent their lives running from arrives anyway. When the hollow victory comes, and the grief is still there, and the framework finally meets the one thing it was never built to survive. Section 10. The hollow victory. Every story about a genius eventually arrives at the moment the genius wins. The theory gets proven. The enemy gets defeated. The thing they have been building toward for years finally lands. And the expectation, built up across all the years of watching someone brilliant and difficult and impossible push toward a single destination, is that the arrival will mean something. That getting there will change something fundamental about the person. That the win will be the thing that finally makes the life make sense in retrospect. It almost never works that way. Not because the win is not real, not because the achievement does not matter in the world, but because the person who arrives at the destination is not the same person who started walking toward it. The years of the journey changed them. The obsession reshaped them. The addiction to the pursuit became the structure of the self. And when the pursuit ends, what is left is not a person ready to enjoy the arrival. What is left is a person who does not know what to do without the thing they organized everything around. Albert Einstein arrived at this in April 1955. He died in a hospital in Princeton, New Jersey, with the notebook he had been working on placed on the table beside his bed. The notebook contained his latest attempt at the unified field theory. He had been working on it until he was too sick to continue. He never finished it. But the hollow victory for Einstein was not the unfinished theory. The unfinished theory was the obsession that kept him moving. The hollow victory was everything else. The Nobel Prize that came for the wrong work. The decades of fame that commemorated a version of him that had already passed. The name that became the global shorthand for genius, while the actual man behind it was increasingly isolated and wrong about the direction his field was moving. He had everything the world considers success. He died having called the most consequential act of his career the greatest mistake of his life. The victory was real. The life inside it was not what anyone standing outside it imagined it to be. Rick Sanchez's hollow victory is the most precisely constructed moment in the show's entire run, and it arrives in season 7 in the episode called Unmortrican. Rick finally finds Rick Prime. With the help of evil Morty, he tracks him down and corners him. The fight that follows is not quick or clean. It is brutal and extended, and Rick takes serious damage during it, but he wins. Rick Prime, the man who murdered Diane and Beth in the garage, who set in motion the entire chain of events that turned Rick C-137 into the person the show has been exploring for 7 seasons, is killed. The search is over, and Rick feels nothing. This is not a reading of the scene. The show makes it explicit. After Rick Prime is dead, Rick sits with the outcome, and the show does not give him a moment of catharsis or relief or closure. It gives him emptiness. The thing he spent decades organizing his entire existence around is done, and the grief that started the whole search is still there, unchanged. Because killing Rick Prime does not bring Diane back. It does not return the version of himself that existed before the bomb came through the portal. It does not close the wound that the wound was always going to be, regardless of what happened to the man who caused it. Morty, in the aftermath, tries to reach Rick. He does what Morty has always done throughout the show, which is refuse to accept that Rick is as unreachable as Rick presents himself. And Rick, for a moment, almost lets it work. Almost lets the connection be real and sufficient. Almost allows the presence of his grandson to be the thing that fills the space where the hunt used to be. The show does not give Rick an easy version of this. It does not let him suddenly become available in the way that 7 seasons of evidence have established he cannot be. But it also does not leave him entirely alone with the emptiness. The episode ends with the suggestion, not a resolution, but a direction, that the ordinary adventures, the ones that do not carry the weight of decades of grief and revenge, might still be worth something. That Morty might still be worth something, not as a shield against pain, but as a genuine reason to keep going. It is a small thing. After 7 seasons of building toward the defeat of Rick Prime, the show offers something small. That is the point. The comparison between these two endings is where the whole essay resolves into something worth saying clearly. Einstein's life, measured by the metrics the world uses to measure a life, was an extraordinary success. He changed the way humanity understands the universe. His work is still the foundation of how scientists describe gravity and space and time. He is taught in every school in the world. He is one of the most recognized names in human history. Measured by the metrics he himself applied to his own life, the picture is different. He called his letter to Roosevelt the greatest mistake he ever made. He spent the last 30 years of his scientific life on a project that never came together. He watched his field move forward without him. He lost his first marriage, was largely absent from his children's lives, never saw his son Edward after 1933, and described his second marriage as a union of convenience. He died in a hospital in Princeton, a landmark, having not been a beacon for a long time. The winds were real. The life inside the winds was something else. Rick Sanchez, measured by the metrics of his own universe, is also an extraordinary success. He is the smartest being in every dimension he chooses to visit. He has defeated the Galactic Federation, brought down the Council of Ricks, survived situations that would have ended any other version of himself, and finally killed the man who took everything from him. By any external measure, Rick wins, repeatedly and impressively. Measured by the metrics that actually matter to him, in the quiet parts of the show that are not about adventure or cleverness or defeating an enemy, the picture is also different. He drinks because he cannot sleep with what he carries. He wipes his own memories rather than live inside them. He built a multiverse-sized structure to guarantee his own superiority, because without that guarantee, the grief underneath everything else is too large to function next to. He got his revenge and felt nothing. Both men won everything the world around them considered worth winning. Both men arrived at the destination and found it smaller than the journey had made it seem. This is what the comparison between Einstein and Rick Sanchez is actually about. Underneath all the specifics of failed marriages and sick children and atomic bombs and portal guns and unified field theories. It is about what happens when a person organizes their entire inner life around a version of strength that does not include the things that are actually hardest. The strength to stay when staying is painful. The strength to be wrong about something fundamental and rebuild from there. The strength to let someone matter enough that losing them would break you and choose to let them matter anyway. Einstein had moments of that strength. The early letters to Mileva show it. The genuine grief over Edward shows it. The honest admission that the Roosevelt letter was a mistake shows it. But the moments were not enough to change the structure. The structure was built around the work, and the work was built around a certainty that the universe had to be the way he believed it was. And that certainty left no room for the specific kind of openness that the hardest things require. Rick has moments of that strength too. Every time the mask slips and the show lets you see what is underneath. Every time Morty reaches him and he almost lets it land. Every time the adventure stops for a second and the the person inside the genius is briefly, quietly visible. The moments are real. They are also, in both cases, not enough to change the outcome. What separates Rick from Einstein, in the end, is not intelligence. They are operating at levels too far apart to meaningfully compare on that axis. What separates them is that Rick is still moving. Einstein arrived at the end of his story, and the notebook was on the table, and the unified field theory was unfinished, and everything he had called a mistake was already unchangeable history. Rick is still in it. The show, as of its most recent seasons, has not closed the door on the possibility that the small thing Morty offers in the aftermath of Unmortican might grow into something, that the hollow feeling after the victory might be the first honest feeling Rick has allowed himself in decades. That a man who has spent his whole post-Diane life running from the thing underneath his intelligence might eventually stop running. Einstein never stopped running. He ran all the way to the end, notebook open, pen moving, still chasing the theory that would prove the universe worked the way he needed it to work. That is the real difference between the smartest man the real world ever produced and the smartest man any fictional universe has ever imagined. Einstein ran out of time. Rick still has some left. And what he chooses to do with it, now that the hunt is over and the victory is hollow and the grief is still there waiting, is the question the next section will ask in full. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.